Second commandment, thou shalt not use my name in vain. Third commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Fourth commandment, honor thy father, thy mother, and thy children as you love me. Fifth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill the innocent. Seventh commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness, frame, or violate contracts. Eighth commandment, serve me with your heart, not with your offerings. Ninth commandment, those who have committed lesser wrongdoings, first atone for your sins before seeking forgiveness. 10th commandment, honor my name by helping your compatriots and companions. One commandment after another echoed in the ears of the bald rebel, Kalat, causing him to completely prostrate himself. He held his head close to the ground, uncontrollably trembling slightly with reverence, fear, and excitement. As a mid-sequence beyonder, a rebel who had once been educated in the Fasak Empire, he had sufficient insight to understand that the worship of the sea god was based more on fear of powerful forces, fear of the fearsome natural risks that mankind faced, and many rituals that retained primitive bloodshed, a backward faith that reveled in inhumane and uncivilized practices, something that would be eliminated sooner or later. However, the faith he had developed since he was young had made him afraid to go against the divine revelation. He could only bury the idea of modifying the ritual process deep in his heart and avoid the parts which conflicted with his own wishes as much as possible. Now, the sea god's sudden change left him extremely delighted. It was as if he could see the so-called primitive totem, that outsiders claimed it to be, evolving into a true god. Blessed are we, blessed are the rebels, blessed are the true believers. In his blurred vision, Kalat raised his head, spread his hands sincerely, and placed them against his mouth. I will abide by your teachings as if I am praising your name. The blurry figure in front of him disappeared, the magnificent voice by his ears vanished, and the scene in the cave returned to its original state. However, Kalat knew that everything was no longer the same. He moved his elbows several times and quickly crawled back to his wheelchair. He once again sat on it and turned to the other side of the cave. Kalat quickly met with Edmonton. This member of the resistance with a blue sea serpent tattoo was standing in front of the deity figurine that was bleeding abnormally. His forehead was a mix of scarlet red and black, dirty and gruesome. However, Edmonton's expression was joyful, excited, and satisfied. He looked at Kalat and blurted out, "Did you receive the revelation?" "Yes, it's the aura of God, just like before." Kalat nodded in excitement. Not only has God rebuilt the earth, but he has also rebuilt his covenant. Edmonton let out a sigh of relief. I was even suspecting that I was hallucinating before. It seems like as long as an outsider touches the holy sword, God will be able to walk the land again. There's no need for it to be completely lifted. Kalat chimed, indeed. The reason why the deity figurine shattered and bled is because God has changed his image. We must build a new one. Just like the scenes we saw earlier. God also showed his sacred emblem. Above the symbol of the waves, there was a scepter in the shape of lightning, surrounded by strong winds, Edmonton said as he recalled. Kalat immediately patted the armrest of his wheelchair. Let's find the high priest right now. He should have also received the revelation. We will usher in a new world. Above the grey fog, Klein put down the sea god's scepter and rubbed his temples in exhaustion. He had noticed a problem earlier. The sea god's scepter could respond to ritualistic magic, which meant that it could provide a certain amount of strength to help the worshipper complete the ritual and achieve their goals. However, it could only be concentrated within his domain and could not exceed the limit. Whatever could be done was relatively limited. For example, the Evernight goddess could use a method of influencing fate to let her believers naturally obtain the money they needed and pay their debt. As for the sea god's scepter, it could at most produce fake money on the altar, and after a while, it would become ineffective and return to its true form. This is the difference between a false god and a true god. Besides, apart from the grey fog, as long as it fulfills the procedure in prayer, the the sea god's scepter is capable of automatically responding to ritualistic magic, unless it will use up more than half of its power in one go. This might be why the steps to ritualistic magic are extremely important. Above the gray fog, prayers will be screened, reduced to points of light. The sea god's scepter is unable to automatically respond, hence, requiring me to manually handle them. This makes it relatively troublesome. It's impossible for me to stay here all day. Of course, there's also a benefit to it. As long as the prayer doesn't have any mistakes, and it is accurately pointed towards the sea god's scepter, regardless of how perfunctory the ritual is, they will be able to receive a response. The only criteria is that I'm in a good mood. I'll think of a solution when I'm free. I'll make it so that even if the sea god's scepter is above the gray fog, it will be an automated answering machine. Produce a paper angel. That's useless, as it doesn't have any soul injected into it. Make a mechanical and rigid puppet to handle the repeated and trivial ritualistic magic. I wonder if a Nimblewright master has powers related to this. At the very least, Rosago only showed traits of controlling a person like a puppet. As Klein's thoughts slowly settled, his eyes moved to the iron cigar case. After some research, he discovered that this cigarette case that had a severely corroded exterior had undergone some abnormal changes. It was firmer, tougher, and more resistant to corrosion. However, it was still within a comprehensible and acceptable range of normal humans. It isn't equipped with any special properties. However, if it were placed here for a few years, decades, or even longer where it holds beyonder characteristics and mystical items, perhaps it could really evolve into a sealing case whose effects would gradually fade one day. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched, and he turned his head to look at the junk pile in the corner. They were covered by the gray fog, almost blending in with the surroundings. Heh heh. Klein laughed dryly and looked away. He fiddled with the crushed golden wine cup again, confirming that there was nothing wrong with it. After doing all this, he entered the real world and summoned himself once more to bring the sun brooch and other items back to his room in the inn. At this very moment, the clouds in the sky had disappeared, and the moon was scattering its crimson tranquility. The entire city of generosity, Byam, remained asleep in its dreams. 9 a.m., Cathedral of Waves. Alger was summoned, and by using the excuse of a confession, he once again met the diocese bishop, Chogo. Look for this person. Chogo handed over the portrait in his hand. Another mission. What's going on recently? Alger muttered in his mind as he unfolded the piece of paper. When he saw the contents of the portrait, he almost couldn't control his laughter. It was impossible to tell if the figure in the portrait was male or female, or what they looked like. How was he supposed to find them? In a split second, he thought of something and didn't try to hide his change in mood. Instead, he deliberately blurted out, "Who is this?" The portrait depicted an unusually blurry and mysterious person, with no characteristics that could be used to aid in a search. There was no such mission yesterday. A sudden demand to pursue this person this morning. What happened last night? Calvetua perished completely. With that happening, the church and the military would definitely search for its remains. Simeem Island is the clue. This person took away the most important item ahead of them. Who is this person? Alger's heart skipped a beat, and he almost didn't dare meet Chogo's eyes. Chogo nodded, a dirty, despicable thief. He may be from Intis or Fasak, and he may belong to the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun or the Church of the God of Combat. Someone from Intis or Fasak, or someone from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun or the Church of the God of Combat. Why would there be such a guess and conclusion? His Eminence John Cotman only received little information at the scene and was unable to pinpoint the target. In this case, it's indeed possible to presume that this person is from either Intis or Fasak, as the main supporters of the resistance and Calvetua are from those two countries. There is reason to believe that they may have already known where Calvetua was hiding. It fits my theory from before. Of course, it could also be something else. Alger controlled his emotions and asked, "What did he do?" "You don't need to know. Just pay attention to any abnormalities from people from Intis or Fasak in Biome. Yes, also include the locals who have become Beyonders. Also, find the people who previously posted the notice on the front door of the cathedral. They might know something, and they could quickly give you further information," George ordered in a deep voice. "This is indeed a direction. This is tantamount to telling me that this person has something to do with the notice and the perishing of Calvetua. I wonder whose hands Calvetua's Beyonder characteristic landed in. Who? Right, the world is in Biome. Something happened to Calvetua not long after he came here. Could this be Mr. Fool's purpose? Would this help him in the process of removing the seal and regaining his strength?" Alger's pupils contracted as he recalled his conjecture from a while ago. When he woke up, Klein, who had reaped a bountiful harvest last night, was uplifted and in a good mood. He decided to treat himself today and make sure that his 3 meals would be sumptuous and delicious. As he pushed open the door and walked into the living room, he saw that Danitz was out of bed, untying the bandage and splint around his arm. He recovered that quickly. Klein was stunned for a moment seeing Gehrman Sparrow look over. Danitz chuckled and said, "My ability at recovering isn't too bad. My sequence 9 is called Hunter. I received a clear improvement in various aspects of my body, allowing me to surpass ordinary humans. When it comes to combat, I experienced a great enhancement. Besides, I'm already at sequence 7. Sequence 9 Hunter. I've killed one, and I know the corresponding sequence SXS name is Conspiracist." Klein suddenly recalled the first enemy he encountered back when he first arrived in Backland. It had sucked him into a maelstrom that he was almost unable to extricate himself from. "Sequence 8, Provoker?" Klein asked in passing. He had long since guessed Danitz's Beyonder pathway from his adeptness at using fire. It was the Red Priest pathway which Roselle had called a true man. Sequence 7 was called the Pyromaniac, also known in ancient times as Fire Mage. Danitz froze for a second, thinking that Gehrman Sparrow was doubting him. He subconsciously raised his voice. "Do you think I'm not good at provoking?" "No, I'm an expert in this field." Danitz threw the splint and bandages into the trash, flexed his left arm, and said, "Typically, a pirate's provocation is an insult, but I'm different. I do targeted insults. This requires one to grasp a lot of information and rumors, and also understand the provocation target. Only by doing this will you be able to make him lose his mind and cause his brain to be burnt out with a single sentence." He paused for a second and said, "Just like with steel. You can curse him, calling him dogsh *t, or you could curse his parents and captain, but that will be useless. However, if you do an action and throw in a line with that, he will definitely turn into a bull who only sees red." With that, Danitz put his hands on his hips, held his crotch, and shouted in a low, scornful voice, "B*tch. I really want to hit him. He lives up to being a provoker. Indeed, Steel Mavedi has such tendencies and hobbies, tsk." Klein loosened his subconsciously clenched fists. "This is what you call professional provocation." Danitz spread out his hands in conclusion. "If I meet a beast, a monster, or someone who cannot be communicated with since they had lost control, I can proactively emit a feeling that they hate. This is a Beyonder power. People with such Beyonder powers would either be great at receiving beatings, or they would be great at escaping. Clearly, you belong to the latter." Klein cursed inwardly. Without having to worry about his injured left arm, Danitz was in a good mood as he continued, "Actually, I'm very good at setting up traps. It's a pity that you didn't agree with my plan when hunting Steel Mavedi." Klein resisted the twitching of his mouth as he calmly replied, "You still have a chance." "What chance?" Danitz asked out of curiosity. "A chance to set up traps for Beyonders such as Steel. One by one, I'll introduce you to them." Klein smiled. Danitz was momentarily at a loss for words. He knew very well that traps were often ineffective against a man who wasn't afraid of guns, projectiles, fire, or water. Danitz let out a hollow chuckle and turned to look out the window. The weather has cleared up. Does that mean that the serpent, Calvetua, is dead? Klein answered tersely without hiding the truth. Danitz exhaled, hesitated, then said, regardless, after this citywide sweep, few pirates will dare come to Byam for some time. This will definitely include Admiral of Blood. Your plan of hunting him with Captain might have to come to an end. The Sonia Sea is so big, so it's very difficult to find a fleet that intentionally hides their whereabouts. Moreover, they can head for the Fog Sea, Berserk Sea, North Sea, and Polar Sea. If it was that easy to kill a pirate admiral at sea, the church and the military would have done it a long time ago. Let me return to the Golden Dream as soon as possible. Danitz lampooned under his breath. Don't worry, I have a way, and this will be your job. Klein asked without batting an eyelid, what's your captain's opinion? He had already spent £12 to obtain a radio receiver through Furs, but he had been too busy with matters regarding the sea god to bother with it. Hence, he hadn't taken it out from the junk pile above the grey fog to bring to the real world. Meanwhile, Klein had received the money from Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man, raising his fortune to £7,085 and 5 gold coins. A wealth at this level was enough to buy a rather large and productive manor anywhere. If it wasn't for my revenge and my hope of finding a way back to Earth, I could have already retired. Klein thought in satisfaction. Captain's opinion. Danitz forced a smile and said, although Captain and the others should have entered within a 500 nautical mile radius, in theory, allowing the attempt of a soulfall ritual, you should know that the sea routes aren't entirely safe. Pirates have to be careful not to get caught by the military or the church. For this, they often need to take detours. I believe we should wait another day before doing the soulfall ritual so as to prevent any wastage of energy and materials. Okay. Klein didn't give any affirmative answers and had turned towards the washroom. He planned on heading out again today to search for a chance to act as another person. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow's back, Danitz exhaled. I must first contact Captain in private and persuade her to let me return to the Golden Dream before I can use the soulfall ritual in front of you. Gehrman Sparrow is someone who likes to head out. I have plenty of opportunities and space. Heh, don't tell me that he enjoys shopping. Danitz thought, curling his lips. After leaving the Cathedral of Waves, Alger Wilson went straight for the Ralph Trading Company in reflection and found the owner, who was reading a newspaper. He was well aware that this middle-aged man, in formal attire, a bow tie, and glasses, was a veteran pirate. He supported the resistance in secret and reverently worshipped sea god Calvetua. What is it, our captain of a ghost ship? Ralph put down the newspaper, crossed his right foot over his left, and smiled leisurely. He was an illegitimate child. His father was an adventurer of Lone and Fasak blood, and his mother was a native. He had made his fortune by becoming a pirate, then being a merchant that did business with both pirates and the officials. He established a vast network of connections that provided him with help at the Governor-General's office, the city council, and the police station. Upon hearing Ralph's question, Alger almost frowned, because the man's attitude and tone were rather abnormal. This abnormality was a state that wasn't in accordance with Alger's expectations. In his opinion, after the fall of sea god Calvetua, he was certain that there would definitely be bad omens in the Rorstad archipelago. The pious believers would definitely sense that something was amiss, either feeling apprehensive or downcast, so how could they still be so relaxed and natural? Alger didn't directly mention Calvetua. Instead, he chuckled and asked, do you know where Kovaro has been recently? Kovaro was the pirate captain who possessed the Beyonder characteristic of the Sanguine Baron. It was said that he was once a sailor aboard the Dark Emperor, and that he was part of the periphery forces of the King of the Five Seas, Nast. Who knows? But he's surely not in Byam, otherwise, he would have been caught in the raids in the past 2 days. Ralph shrugged his shoulders. I heard that his boat went south. Alger actually had an appointment with Kovaro on this matter, and he was only using it as a way to start the conversation. Of course, he was well aware that to avoid the tsunami in the waters of the Rörsted archipelago, Kovaro had definitely gone far away and would take some time before he returned to Byam. However, Alger wasn't too anxious, as he already knew that Mr. Moon had been given an acceptance draft. If he withdrew the sum before its maturity, he would receive a discounted value and lose a large amount of interest. He deliberately nodded his head and said, "Got it, thank you for telling me." At this point, Alger pretended to be unaware of what happened as he asked, "I heard that many see God figurines in many places shattered by themselves." He hadn't witnessed any instances of this himself, but he could make a reasonable deduction based on the church's archives. In many of the colonial islands and countries of the southern continent, more than one or two false gods like Calvetua had been finished off by the seven churches. What happened after their deaths had already long been recorded in the archives. Ralph calmly nodded. Yes, there was such a thing. But that's not bad news. His expression turned fervent. Because God has appeared over the land once again in a new image. God has reappeared over the land once again with a new image. Alger's eyes remained fixed on him, and he felt that this was both reasonable but also unexpected. Judging from the Church of Storm's reaction, he was certain that Calvetua was already dead. Then which sea god was responding to the believers now? Connecting it with his previous judgment, he quickly came up with a bold idea: is it an embodiment of Mr. Fool? He used sea god Calvetua's perishing to create a new identity. He can release his powers through the seal to directly affect an identity in the real world. Is this the real reason for the world to come to Byam? Hiss, Mr. Fool really does things with pomp. Alger secretly swallowed his saliva and suppressed his excitement. In the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein, who had yet to leave, saw the stack of cash Captain Eland handed him. "Here is your reward for a total of £100. He didn't mention how much Gehrman Sparrow and Danitz each received, but he gave a total amount. As for how exactly they would split the reward, that was something he left to them. The military is really generous. Klein silently mused as he received the thick stack of cash, instinctively taking out 2 5-pound notes and tossing them to Danitz. He lowered his wrist and finally drew another 2 10-pound notes in an expressionless manner. Gehrman Sparrow is still rather just, far more just than just Eland. Danitz put away the reward in pleasant surprise. His wallet that had slimmed down quite significantly over the past couple of days had finally been replenished. Glancing at Gehrman Sparrow in his new clothes, Eland asked, after some deliberation, with his boat-shaped hat in hand, "News from the Church of Storms has revealed that the person who posted the notices on the cathedral's door, informing them of the problem between Letitia and sea god Calvetua, was Blazing Danitz. What do you think about that?" He stared straight into Danitz's eyes and waited for an answer. "Ha!" Danitz gave a hollow chuckle. "I don't know him." Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "While fulfilling a dead adventurer's wish, I came across Letitia and her companions at the inn. Snakes invaded our place in the middle of the night, but they easily resolved it. After returning to Byam, I went to purchase some items from the resistance and discovered that they had taken out their holy sword. Furthermore, there were 2 mid-sequence Beyonders guarding that small base. I felt a crazy will invade my body just by making contact with that holy sword for a moment, and I had nearly lost control on the spot. They were still after Letitia." What Klein said was the truth. It wasn't the entire truth, but it was enough to infer the contents of the announcement. Even if the kingdom's military and the Church of Storms were to investigate further, they would only be able to unearth the fact that Gehrman Sparrow could change his appearance. After listening carefully, Eland sighed and smiled. "If there are such things in the future, you don't have to post notices in the middle of the night. You can come find me directly. This will allow you to reap even greater rewards." He stood up, put on his hat, and said to Danitz, "I heard that the bounty for blazing is going to rise again." "Bounty?" The muscles in Danitz's cheek twitched as he forced a smile, pretending that he wasn't blazing and that he didn't care. When Eland left, he turned sharply to face Gairman Sparrow and said, "I think we should move to another inn." "No, we'd better leave Byam as soon as possible. If I'm worth a bounty of more than £5,000, I won't be safe anywhere. The pirates and adventurers who are at the same level as me would definitely rush over like sharks smelling blood. Pray that they can finish off while also proving themselves and giving them a high bounty are always very popular. They're worth no less than treasure." Danitz suppressed even more of his inward shouting. Klein didn't agree or disagree, he slowly smiled. "Are you worried that your bounty will be too high?" Danitz nodded heavily, finally feeling as though the madman, Gairman Sparrow, was finally saying something sensible. "Besides hiding, there are other solutions," Klein said as he walked over to the coat rack. "What are they?" Danitz asked subconsciously. Klein took off his half-top hat and put it on his head. "Raise your sequence. Let your strength match the bounty." He put on his coat, twisted the handle, and walked out of the suite. "Raise myself to sequence 6. Become a conspiracist." Danitz paused for 2 seconds, then he frowned and grimaced. When he consumed the sequence 9 Hunter and sequence 8 Provoker potions, he didn't find it much of a problem. In fact, he began to long for finding the legendary treasures, obtain mid or high sequence formulas and their corresponding materials to advance to a demigod, and then become the new king of the sea. However, the intense pain and discomfort brought to him by the pyromaniac potion had left him in fear and apprehension. He didn't dare believe that he nearly lost control despite strictly following his captain's instructions of constantly provoking his opponents. This forced Danitz to consider whether or not he was fine just getting rich so that he could return to Intis a rich man. He stood there, troubled for several minutes. Finally, he thought of a question. Even if I want to advance by consuming a potion, it's not something I can do in a short period of time. I'll still have to find the formula and collect the ingredients. It wouldn't be an easy task, and the new bounty might be released tomorrow or even today. So, I must change inns and leave Byam as soon as possible. After Alger left the Ralph Trading Company, he casually went to a few places to inquire about the situation. When it was almost noon, he received a new report from the Church of Storms. It's confirmed that the person who posted the notices at the door of the cathedral is Blazing Danitz. Pay attention to his whereabouts. Blazing Danitz. Alger held the slip of paper in his hand and ruminated over the name silently. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he no longer had any doubts in his mind. With ease and certainty, he felt confident about going out to sea to hunt for materials. This was because his quest would happen at sea and because Mr. Fool has a new identity, Sea God. Having missed the morning's blue star, Danitz waited until 4 in the afternoon to attempt the soulfall ritual. While Gairman Sparrow was out, he drew the god of knowledge and wisdom's sacred emblem with familiarity, an omniscient eye on an open book, with the appropriate altar set up. Inside the wall of spirituality, he lit a candle and picked up the lavender and mint extract before dripping it onto the still burning flame. A refreshing fragrance filled the air, and Danitz burned several more herbal powders. Having done all this, he took a step back and said in ancient Hermes, "I pray for the power of knowledge, I pray for the power of rationality, I pray for the God of wisdom's loving grace, I pray that you allow me to communicate with the spirit of Edwina Edwards, the teacher who pursues knowledge, the researcher of spirit world creatures, Vice Admiral Iceberg of the Seas, who hails from Lenberg." Whoosh! Along with the echo of the incantation, the interior of the altar suddenly became cold. Apart from the 3 candles, the remaining brass dagger, the salt plate, the bottle of extract, and the fountain pen and paper all floated in midair. Danitz waited nervously, not knowing what was going to happen next. After nearly 20 seconds, the flames of the 3 candles began to sway, coloring the candles in a pale green color. Danitz's body suddenly stiffened. He felt an icy chill invade his body in an irresistible manner. He saw his feet move uncontrollably, and he took a step forward. He saw his left hand rise and grab the black fountain pen and a piece of white paper. He saw himself bend over with a pen in his left hand, quickly writing, "Is there something?" The words were exquisite and artistic, very different from Danet's own style. It was only then that Danetz realized he could control his head and his throat. "Captain, see God Calvetua is dead." He squeezed out his hoarse voice as though he was suffering from a heavy cold. Details. His right hand wrote smoothly. This was the opportunity Danetz had been waiting for. He immediately recounted everything that had happened, including Gehrman Sparrow's visit to Simim Island in order to fulfill some adventurer's dying wish, the possibility that Gehrman Sparrow had suffered the sea god's curse and how he easily resolved the problem after closing the door, including the madman's mistake of mistaking the ancient elven ruins as a sea god ruin. Towards the end, Danetz quickly added his own take on the matter. "I believe that Admiral of Blood won't come to Byam for quite a substantial period of time. Most famous pirates wouldn't. It will take at least half a year for this matter to pass. Captain, your hunting plan with Gehrman Sparrow might have to be shelved for the time being. 1-to-1 wish to return to the Golden Dream." His left hand froze for a few seconds before writing, "Continue to follow Gehrman Sparrow, and be my contact point with him. Captain, why you can teach him the soulfall ritual." Danetz yelled hoarsely. His left hand wrote, "This can only be done within 500 nautical miles, and in the case of the person holding the ritual, it would be quite risky for him. And you have our points of contact on the various islands. Those are things that cannot be told to outsiders." Indeed. Gehrman Sparrow is just an outsider. "But, Captain, I really want to go back to the Golden Dream." Danetz racked his brains and said, "Maybe we can invite him to be a guest on the ship." "No, this." Suddenly an idea came to Danetz. "Captain, he has a messenger. He has a messenger. A messenger that travels through the spirit world to deliver letters for him. This should be an unrestricted means of communication, and it should be more private and secure. I don't need to be the contact person anymore." Danetz thought in abnormal delight. His left hand hung in midair for a few seconds before he wrote, "If that's the case, there's no problem. As the New Year holiday is coming to an end, it's indeed time for you to return to the ship. You do have some talent in languages, but you still have quite a few problems in other areas. You need to attend more classes and work harder." Danetz opened his mouth, but nothing came out of it. He suddenly felt that returning to the Golden Dream wasn't anything to look forward to. In the evening, Klein returned to the Wind of Azure Inn. He didn't find a suitable target for acting despite an entire day's work. Due to the sweep from before, many pirates and adventurers that were wanted were arrested. The remaining ones continued hiding cautiously, not daring to go out at all. Whether it was the bars, casinos, or brothels, business was poor and there weren't many customers. "So this is the situation." Danetz came over. He cleared his throat and gave a hollow chuckle. "It would be my first time using the soulfall ritual, and I don't have much confidence. I did a test ahead of time, and haha, it succeeded. I managed to communicate with Captain, and she believes there's no chance to hunt Admiral of Blood any time soon. She plans on summoning me back to the Golden Dream. As for us communicating, don't you have a messenger? You can use the messenger to send Captain a letter. My messenger was given by a big shot, and it's not mine. Moreover, the messenger can only send messages back and forth between the owner and the owner of the token, without involving anyone else. Yes, it can also be between the host of a ritual and the owner. That reminds me, I have to find a way to get a messenger of my own, or many things will be inconvenient. As for the solution to this, obviously, it's to write to Mr. Azek, who has to be an expert on the matter." Klein calmly pulled over a chair and sat down. He leaned forward and said in a low voice, "Tell your captain that I have a way to find Admiral of Blood." Huh? Danetz was stunned, having not expected such an answer. Then, he saw the corners of Gehrman Sparrow's mouth slowly widen as he repeated, tell your captain. If Danitz shivered. He didn't dare to make any inquiries as he forced a smile. We'll have to wait until the next blue star, which is between 11 p.m. and midnight tonight. Very good. Klein smiled as he praised. But Danitz wasn't happy at all. Klein stood up slowly, recollecting a special dish he had eaten for dinner, and he headed for the bedroom. The food was called the tiativa, and translated into loan, it was meat within fruit. The cook used a giant local fruit, tina, hollowed out its flesh, leaving only a solid shell, then stuffed it with mashed mutton and fish, followed by sea salt and several types of spices, and repeatedly roasted it over the fire. The meat was fresh, fragrant, and perfectly blended with the sweet and slightly sour flavor of the fruit. Closing the door behind him, Klein first wrote a letter thanking Mr. Azek for his earlier guidance, then he asked again how he could have a messenger of his own. After folding the letter, he took out his copper whistle and summoned the messenger. The messenger didn't stay, disintegrating the moment it took the letter. Phew! Klein rested for a moment, ready to enter the space above the gray fog to see if the prayers of the believers could bring him any useful information, such as who he could actually act as. Above the gray fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Seated in the fool's chair, Klein raised his right hand, allowing the sea god's scepter to fly out of the junk pile and land in his palm. He originally planned on placing this sealed artifact, that was on the level of a grade 1 sealed artifact, beside his chair. This was to show respect to a demigod item, but after careful consideration, he believed that the sea god scepter was still unable to match up with the mysterious and powerful fool, who was able to fight against the true creator and primordial demoness. Only a card of blasphemy was barely qualified to match his status. Therefore, he threw the sea god scepter into the junk pile. Looking at the blue dots surrounding the white bone staff, Klein willed them to split into preliminary categories. Just as he had expected, those blue dots of light automatically split according to his will. Those that merely praised sea god and were prayers with no clear reason sank to the bottom and then rapidly disappeared. Those regarding confessions and pleas floated upward and came closer to Klein's palm. Following his spiritual intuition, he tapped one of the latter. All of a sudden, he saw tall, surging waves and heard the violent whistling of a gust of wind. A fishing boat was bobbing up and down in the undulating deep blue sea, as though it was ready to capsize at any moment. Above the fishing boat, the natives were either hugging the mast or pulling on ropes, making their last-ditch efforts to survive. Many of them were panicking as they chanted the honorific name of sea god. Noticing that this was an ongoing prayer, Klein lifted the milky white scepter. At the tip of the scepter, the blue-colored gems emitted a halo of light one after another before they connected into one and shone onto the scene. The fishermen were gradually losing all hope when all of a sudden, they felt the ship which had been thrown into the air stabilize. They looked around in amazement and saw that the mountain-like waves had calmed down at some point, and the raging winds were slowly calming down, turning as mild as Zarharbir. The overbearing dark clouds in the sky dissipated, and a storm was forcefully pushed back by a mysterious force before it could fully assume its full form. The fishermen quickly recovered from their dazed states and understood what had happened. Sea God has protected everyone. Sea God has shown his majesty. Plop. 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 All of them prostrated themselves on the deck, spread their hands, and placed them to their mouths, reciting the honorific name of Sea God in an irregular fashion. Thank you, praise you. Adorer of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Worsted Archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua. Above the gray fog, Klein felt a little depressed. I was the one who saved you, so why are you thanking Calvetua? That sea serpent will only deliberately create hurricanes, set off waves, and intimidate you so that you would piously believe in it. Klein fell silent for 2 seconds, then he suddenly burst out laughing. Calvetua is already dead, and the current Calvetua is another one of my identities. Why should I be in a bad mood when people are thanking my other identity? This is something a faceless has to take note of when acting for real. To fully immerse oneself in the role, treating all emotions one receives as their own, but also never forgetting who they really are. This is difficult to accomplish. Failure to pay attention to it can result in an abnormal state of mind. And once a beyonder's state of mind becomes abnormal, they won't be far from losing control. After thinking for a while, Klein let out a sigh and chuckled to himself. Acting the role of sea god has been quite rewarding after all. Although such acting doesn't provide feedback due to the gray fog screening and isolation, nor does it facilitate the digestion of the faceless potion, it can provide me with experience and lessons, helping me figure out a safer and more effective way of acting. Wrapping up his thoughts, Klein spread his spirituality to another point of light. This time, the plea came from under a bridge. A woman with tattered clothes and a festering body was leaning against a corner, mumbling the honorific name of sea god as she made her final confession. Through her descriptions, Klein seemed to have witnessed her short life. She was a native woman whose parents believed in sea god. As a result, she inherited the faith of sea god. In the first decade or so, her father worked as a miner, repairing roads and laying the rails, while her mother focused on temporary jobs, sewing, doing laundry, helping out at the docks, and occasionally working as a street girl. Only then did the family barely survive. An abrupt change occurred 2 years ago. Her father had died during a road repair accident, and the Rorsted Railroad Company had offered only a pittance of compensation. This pushed the family onto a path of no return. Subsequently, the girl was sold to the Red Theater by her mother and became a legal prostitute. Although Emperor Roselle had long invented the condom, many pirates and adventurers were unwilling to use one in their desire for momentary pleasure. And since the Red Theater didn't enforce the use of condoms, the girl's resistance was ineffective. All she could do was submit, eventually getting infected with some disease. The manager of the Red Theater had tried to provide her some simple treatment, but seeing that she wasn't getting any better, she was chased out because the cost of the follow-up treatment was obviously much higher than the cost of buying another girl. Not only was the ill girl unable to find a new job, but she didn't even have the money to rent a house. Her mother and younger siblings had long since disappeared, perhaps already dead or abducted to become slaves. The girl became a tramp and lived under the bridge. She managed to survive for some time thanks to the food and free medicine provided by charity organizations. But it was ultimately a short period of time. Her illness got worse and worse, and her body became weaker and weaker. Very quickly, she reached the end of her life. At that moment, she recalled the days when she was the most fed and dressed. She recalled the words that the pirates and adventurers would occasionally say. She whispered and prayed to see God, "I want to live like a human being." Klein once again raised his staff, but he found that this sealed artifact didn't possess the ability to cure diseases. He thought of purchasing some medicine from Emlyn White via the world, but he found that the prayer scene happened at noon. The girl had already passed away under the bridge, in mud and dirt, her body filled with agony and intense hunger. Klein was silent for a moment, then he raised the angle of the prayer screen to reveal the location of the bridge. After memorizing the characteristics of the nearby streets and the surrounding area, Klein leaned back in his chair, sighed, and said with an insincere smile, "What a humble wish. There isn't much of an opportunity to act. I'll try my best to bury you like a human being." He retracted his attention and scanned the other points of light, searching for someone he could act as, but he found nothing. During this process, Klein noticed that Calotte, Edmonton, and the other members of the resistance were carrying out a ritual. They had placed a batch of items on the altar, and they prayed for sea god to imbue them with power. So that's how they receive the beyonder items they use for trade. To be at the level of a demigod is truly different. Moreover, they're used to not receiving any immediate replies. It's as if they plan to leave the items on the altar the entire night. Apparently, that sea serpent, Calvetua, didn't respond immediately either. It depends on its mood, or whether it was asleep or not. Otherwise, it could only respond instinctively, unable to produce any Beyonder items in batches. Klein picked up the sea god scepter, making the blue gems shine again. Boundless spirituality magically merged together, gushing into the prayer scene with transcendent vibes and randomly fusing with various items. Some of them are electric shock charms, some that allow people to swim in the sea like fish, some that allow a gale to blow. Within 3 months, their spirituality would gradually decline to nothingness. Klein half closed his eyes, feeling the changes in the items. Although he had only responded twice, he was already rather exhausted despite mainly relying on the power of the sea god scepter. However, the first response had to do with him forcibly dispersing a storm and calming the waves, while the second response was to simultaneously provide an enchantment to dozens of items. They were all at the level of a demigod, so it was rather draining on his spirituality. Even if I frequently used the sea god scepter, I wouldn't be able to last very long. On the other hand, the negative side effects wouldn't be a burden on me. I can attempt to use it at times. Yes, the situation with the resistance reminded me. I can also pray to myself and make a bunch of charms, mainly to allow me to do things underwater. This way, even if I find myself in a sea battle, I wouldn't be so restrained. Oh right, I still don't know how to make lightning charms. I need to seek out the corresponding mysticism information, and with it, I can deal with enemies who have air superiority. Klein silently muttered a few sentences and threw the sea god scepter back into the junk pile while swiftly returning to the real world. Eastchester County. By the side door of a huge manor in the vast and beautiful countryside. Audrey Hall was dressed in a waist-fitting black riding suit with a simple blouse lining her insides. She skillfully sat on the back of a brownish-red mare without showing the slightest sign of wobbling. Her black leather boots were in the stirrups, with her white trousers slightly tucked into them. She smiled at Susie, who had a leather bag on her back. "I wait for you at the edge of the woods." With that, she bent down with the whip in her hand and let the brownish-red mare gallop across the open field. Compared to the gorgeous yet gloomy family castle, Audrey preferred the beautiful manor and the scenery of the countryside. One handsome horse after another came running out. The riders were servants and maidservants, and their only mission was to protect Miss Audrey. Susie was also running happily, a feeling she couldn't experience in Backlund. Moreover, she and Audrey would have a little adventure today, and that was exploring an ancient tower in the forest that had collapsed a long time ago. The valuable items there had long been taken away, but there had never been any accidents that happened there. It was a perfect place for an inexperienced person to practice her various abilities. The only problem was that it would be dark in 2 hours, and there might not be enough time. Eastchester County was still cold in January, with snow often piling up. The branches and leaves of the trees were withered, with beasts hiding themselves, making it appear lifeless. Audrey led Susie around the ancient tower several times while surrounded by her attendants and maidservants, but they found nothing. There were only piles of gray bricks and rotten wood, and in the gaps, there were weeds and the corpses of tiny critters. Audrey had thought she could find some murals on the wreckage of the walls, allowing her to decipher the origins of the ancient tower and use the appearance of wild beasts to secretly practice her Beyonder skills such as awe, frenzy, placate, but she was only left very disappointed. This isn't a tiny adventure. It's just a stroll on horseback. She pursed her lips, held her whip, and walked to her horse. Unwilling to resign herself to this, she asked the attendants and maidservants around her when she had traveled half the distance, "Are there any legends of monsters nearby?" Half of the attendants had followed her from Backlund to the family castle before coming to this manor. The other half were locals and were usually busy in the manor. There was no doubt that Audrey was asking the latter. The reason why she had come to this manor was because, historically, there was a folk tradition of worshipping dragons in the surrounding areas. A young attendant secretly shot a glance at his noble and beautiful mistress. He mustered his courage, took 2 steps forward, and bowed while saying, "Deep in this forest, there are many fearsome wild beasts. Every year, hunters die there, but no one has ever encountered a monster before. It's just like the situation described in an old folk song that goes around this place. He recounted the folk song and the general meaning was, monsters are in your dreams, dragons are in your dreams, the great imagined palace, floating in the air, is also in your dreams, there is the place where you will have everything, all the way until you wake up. Curious children, brave adventurers, go and find the dragon in your dreams. The attendant deliberately left out the last line, because he might be misunderstood as being sarcastic to Miss Audrey. A dragon in a dream. The great palace that is imagined and floating in the air is also in a dream. Audrey carefully pondered for a few seconds before she suddenly felt that this ancient folk song wasn't completely meaningless. According to the information about dragons that she'd bought from Little Sun, the dragon of imagination, Ankwelt, had actually imagined a floating city with massive temple pillars supporting a towering palace complex. The name of the city was Liveseed, meaning the city of miracles. In dreams, the spectator pathway comes under the mind dragons, involving the conscious, subconscious, the sea of collective subconscious, and the sky of spirituality. No matter how you look at it, it certainly involves the dream domain. Perhaps this ancient folk song really is pointing to something. Could Liveseed really exist in the sea of collective subconscious, in dreams? But a dream is purely in the mind. Many thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind. Even when she returned to the manor, she was still unable to come up with a clear train of thought. Entering the room, she glanced at Susie, suddenly having the urge to show off. Susie doesn't know anything about dragons, so she definitely wouldn't be able to detect the peculiarities of this folk song. No, don't be arrogant, that's too superficial. And it's easy for Susie to discover that I'm hiding something. Audrey walked a few steps back and forth with her back straight, and she asked in a seemingly casual manner, Susie, what do you think that folk song is really about? I have a nagging feeling that it's not as simple as it seems. Susie opened her mouth, momentarily at a loss for words because she didn't know anything about poetry. She gave it some serious thought and said, Audrey, I'm only a dog. In a forest in Blue Mountain Island. Because of his agitation and excitement, Colot didn't sleep at all. Sitting on the wheelchair, he inspected his surroundings, as if he had found a reason to live apart from revenge. After making a full circle, he returned to the altar to pray once again. He remembered the contents of the 10 Commandments very clearly. He knew that he couldn't use God's name in vain, so he planned to use the relatively vague God as a replacement during his prayers. When he approached the altar, his gaze suddenly turned into a stare because the items placed on it all had an unusual aura. For example, a dagger didn't reflect any crimson moonlight but released silver lightning. A leaf had become increasingly greener, making him feel that it was easier to breathe from a mere glance. God has bestowed his grace. This thought suddenly flashed in Colot's mind. Up to this point, he no longer had any doubts regarding the transformation of God. The sacrilegious thoughts hidden deep within him were completely dispelled. The revelation from God that previously said that he will walk the land again was an implication that he is reconstructing his image. This layer of meaning goes very deep, and we actually failed to interpret it before. Colot slowly took in a deep breath and propped himself up with his hands before solemnly prostrating himself before the great sea god. Soon, he returned to his wheelchair and headed for the residence of the high priest, Edmonton, and the others. He couldn't wait to tell his companions about what had just happened, to share with them the grace of God. At 11:15 in the evening, Klein sat in his chair and watched with a blank expression as Danitz held the soulfall ritual, memorizing all the details while he did it. It still requires help from the spirit world. He made a preliminary judgment. If it's a spirit world creature, one can locate them as long as there's no mistake in the description. Just using a language with a certain amount of power can allow direct summoning or allow them to make their spirit descend. It has nothing to do with distance or range. To a certain extent, deities have this trait as well, but sometimes it's possible to get a response from them even if the prayer is in an ordinary language. Of course, that is only if they have become believers and have caught the notice of the deity. At the level of demigods, they seem to have blended with the spirit world to a certain extent. That's why one can point towards them with an accurate description to receive the possibility of a response. But there will be a distance limitation. Once it's beyond a range, they wouldn't be able to receive the signal. See God Calvetua is an example. Vice Admiral Iceberg is considered a powerful mid-sequence beyonder. To achieve something like this, relying on herself isn't sufficient. She needs to use the aid of a corresponding deity, and use a precise and unambiguous description. Furthermore, there are restrictions on distance and range. The moment Klein finished organizing his thoughts, the various items on the altar began to float up, with the exception of the 3 candles. Danitz shuddered uncontrollably, his expression turning cold. Very soon, he let out the female voice of Vice Admiral Iceberg. "Good evening." Her tone seems to contain the anger of being woken up. Klein felt that Danitz's entire person had turned feminine. He hesitated for a moment and said, "I have a way to find Admiral of Blood." "What?" Edwina Edwards, whose spirit had possessed Danitz, already had her tone return to normal, one that usually lacked emotion. Klein said simply, "They use the latest wireless telegraphy technology. I received the frequencies and passcodes from White Shark." "Wireless telegraphy. You know such things?" Edwina appeared surprised to learn that Gehrman Sparrow, who was an expert in mysticism, would also have some general knowledge of radio communication technology. Klein politely smiled. "A little." Edwina was silent for 2 seconds, then she asked through Danitz, "Have they discovered that? Are you referring to whether Admiral of Blood and Company have discovered the leak of their frequencies and passcodes?" "In theory, they should have, since their intelligence officer, Old Quinn, has died at the hands of Mr. Hanged Man. However, wireless telegraphy hasn't reached the level of wide-scale adoption yet, so it's easy for those who use it to ignore security risks." Klein didn't respond with absolute certainty. "Perhaps. But we can try. As long as I can listen in on the frequency, there's a very high chance of finding Admiral of Blood. As see God, even at the level of a demigod, making it difficult for me to know about matters in neighboring seas like the back of my hand, I can still control sea creatures and ask them to seek people out." Klein silently added. Edwina said thoughtfully, "I'll have Danitz help with the surveillance. You know a lot about wireless telegraphy as well." Klein grinned and said, "Okay." When the soulfall ritual was over, Danitz watched Gehrman Sparrow take out a sizable piece of machinery and its corresponding accessories, with mixed emotions. "What is this?" he asked in astonishment. Klein said flatly, "Radio transceiver." Danitz turned agape as he finally forced his question out, "Where did you get it?" Klein glanced at him. Outside, as he spoke, he tossed the manual and information on the frequencies and passcodes to Danitz and went back to his bedroom to sleep. So this is what he does on his frequent trips out. Danitz felt as though he had understood something. After much reading and experimenting, he finally mastered the usage of the radio transceiver and settled back into his reclining chair. He was soon snoring away. Without knowing how long he slept, he was suddenly awoken, astonished to hear rhythmic clicks. "What?" Danitz rolled to his feet and looked towards the source of the sound. He saw the radio transceiver in the dim room working on its own, spitting out illusory sheets of white paper under the serene moonlight. "What's this?" Danitz conjured flames in his palms as he carefully inched forward. This scene reminded him of the horror stories that pirates often spoke of when they were bragging. "There's a problem with the radio transceiver. It's connected to an evil spirit." Danitz decided to yell for Gehrman Sparrow the moment he discovered anything amiss. As he approached the radio transceiver, he saw several lines of ancient Fasak on the illusory sheet of paper. "Hello. I sense a familiar but unique aura, but it's about to dissipate." "Hello." Danitz attempted a response. "Who are you?" The radio transceiver produced its clickety-clack again, spitting out a piece of white paper. "My name is Rhodes. In exchange, you have to answer one of my questions. Ta question. This strange radio transceiver is a little interesting. Danitz cleared his throat. You can ask, but I might not answer. Hee, you think I'm the kind of adventurer or archaeologist who ends up killing himself because of curiosity? Danitz thought with both caution and pride. It took a few seconds for the radio transceiver to produce its clickety-clack again. An illusory piece of white paper was spat out with red words on it. Do you have a secret crush on your captain? No. Don't speak nonsense. Who? Who told you that? Danitz's face instantly reddened. He felt at a loss to have the secret that had been buried deep in his heart for so many years revealed so suddenly. He was embarrassed and ashamed at the same time and subconsciously wanted to deny it, but at the same time, he was also shocked and confused as to how this matter had been discovered by an outsider. He had never told anyone, and he had kept this secret very well hidden. Danitz opened his mouth, forced a smile, and said, "What a silly question, I refuse to answer." The radio transceiver produced its clickety-clack and spat out more white paper. Then let's change the question. If you really don't like her, who can endure such dry and boring lessons? Isn't that right? No. It's because I'm not strong enough to beat her. Danitz blurted out, his expression twisted. The clacking of the radio transceiver became increasingly brisker and the words on the illusory white paper increased. A lie. Let's change the question. The type of female you like is beautiful, powerful, mysterious, intelligent, and someone who is able to step over you, right? If Danitz's lips quivered as he felt as though flames were seemingly rising from his body and smoke was billowing from his head. At this moment, he felt his state of mind explode. It was as if someone had stripped him naked and tossed him into a busy street. Subconsciously, he looked around in panic, searching and avoiding the gazes that might be cast on him. Then, he saw that the bedroom door had opened at some point. Gehrman Sparrow stood there quietly in his white shirt which hadn't been tucked in and his rather loose black trousers. It was unknown how long he had been watching. When did you come out? Danitz stuttered, his face blank. Please tell me that you just opened the door. He prayed inwardly. Klein walked over to the radio receiver that had become paranormal and answered calmly, from the beginning. As a seer, how could I not have sensed the strange activity outside? Even in my sleep, I'll still have my spiritual intuition. Klein chuckled inwardly. Danitz's face instantly turned ashen. He turned his body in a half-circle and rushed toward the radio transceiver that seemed to be possessed by an evil spirit, in a bid to rip up the illusory white paper with the 3 questions. But his hand went through the words without him grabbing onto anything. A scarlet-red fireball formed in his palm again as he thought of blowing up the damn radio transceiver. At this moment, Gehrman Sparrow's cold gaze swept over him. Right, this is his. Danitz froze, looking at Gehrman Sparrow step past him and stop in front of the unusual radio transceiver. A Rhodes. How did it connect to this radio transceiver? It said it sensed a familiar but unique aura which is about to dissipate. Is it referring to the aura of the mysterious space above the gray fog? This radio transceiver was placed above the gray fog for a few days. Although it didn't show any abnormal signs, it still came into contact with the aura. And because of its own functions, it temporarily received information from the spirit world, and this was subsequently discovered by a Rhodes, the magic mirror, that seems to know a lot. Wait, what kind of question was that? I'm Gehrman Sparrow, I'm a cold, crazy adventurer. I'm a professional. 1-to-1 can't laugh out loud. Klein suppressed the corners of his mouth and secretly took a deep breath. Danitz stole a sidewards glance, like a prisoner by the gallows waiting for the noose to be released. Seeing no change in expression from Gehrman Sparrow, he was slightly relieved. He was glad that the person who had watched from the side was a madman and not a normal human being. He wouldn't have any interest in such matters. If it were any other pirate, I would be too embarrassed to return to the Golden Dream. No, I would be too embarrassed to adventure out at sea. He looked with hatred and fear at the radio transceiver, at the demon who called itself a Rhodes. He heard the clacking again and saw a new piece of white paper spit out from the radio transceiver. There were 2 neat lines in Loanese: "Your loyal and humble servant, a Rhodes, is honored to follow in your footsteps once again, constantly at your service." This isn't the same evil spirit as that a Rhodes from before, right? Dannett's face twitched, and he suddenly felt that whatever happened tonight was surreal. Klein, who went through great difficulty to stifle his laughter, keenly caught onto a problem. A Rhodes wasn't here in person and had likely used the spirit world and the radio transceiver's special function to send messages remotely. Therefore, when Dannetz refused to answer the first question, it was powerless to punish him and could only ask another question. That's interesting. In the future, I'll just need to place the radio transceiver above the gray fog for prolonged periods of time, and I'll be able to make it turn into a unique item that receives spirit world information from ghosts. Unfortunately, by the law of conservation of beyonder characteristic, even with the augmentation of the gray fog's aura, its extraordinary abilities would dissipate bit by bit, eventually returning to normal. Yes, to maintain an ordinary item's extraordinary traits without the use of beyonder characteristics, there's another method according to my knowledge in mysticism, that is to carve the honorific name or true name of an angel, or even a deity in a language that can stir the powers of nature onto it. This would be equivalent to borrowing the target's mysticism and power. Of course, the premise is that they agree. I can't do it myself. At least, the piece of paper that I previously used as my bank's passcode in ancient Hermes hasn't undergone any abnormal changes. For real deities, I only know the true name of one, primordial demonis Cheek. If I get her honorific name, together with her true name, what will happen when I engrave them in ancient Hermes onto the radio transceiver? Will it release viruses? Will it appear more aesthetically pleasing in an industrial sense, mesmerizing those with fetishes? Yeah, the outcome with the greatest possibility is that when carving the honorific name and true name, the powers of the primordial demonis will descend, sucking everything dry. This is an extremely precise supernatural direction. Strange thoughts flashed through Klein's mind until a Rhodes greeted him. Perfect. This is a magic mirror that can answer questions. Klein's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head to the side and said to Dannetz, "Go out and guard the door." "All right." Without any hesitation, Dannetz rushed to the door. He was afraid that the demon named a Rhodes would ask him new questions. When Dannetz entered the corridor and closed the door behind him, Klein turned to the radio transceiver which was connected to the magic mirror, a Rhodes, and said in a low voice, "I have some questions." "This is my honor. Can I address you as master?" "The great existence above the spirit world." White paper spat out of the radio transceiver amid clacking sounds. "You're too obsequious and too shameless. Why do I have a nagging feeling that there's a problem?" Klein pondered a little and said, "You can use any form to address me." "Yes, master." A Rhodes used an exclamation mark. "What's your question?" "Where can I find mermaids?" Klein asked directly. Amid clacking sounds, the radio transceiver answered, "To the east of the Gargas archipelago, sail the sea route for a week and there's a chance of meeting mermaids. However, the mermaids there are all believers of the Evernight goddess." This is a little amazing. It's within expectations, but it's also surprising. Klein realized that his previous speculation had turned into reality in a way he didn't expect. Rhodes continued to type, "If it bothers you, you can continue heading east, but it will be very dangerous. That place is no longer a real ocean, but the ruins of the War of the Gods." "Of course, you definitely wouldn't mind that." "Who said that?" "I was still imagining that with the sea god scepter, I would have the chance of entering even the most treacherous of seas. Now, you are telling me it's a sea evolved from the battlefield of gods." "Indeed, there was a war of the gods in ancient times. The time when the Creator reclaimed the ancient gods' authorities." Klein didn't make comment as he watched a Rhodes make the radio transceiver produce more words. In addition, there are reared mermaids in the Church of Evernight's headquarters, in the Cathedral of Serenity, as well as the Sleep Cathedral on Dinos Island. In addition to the Holy Cathedral, there are mermaids on Dinos Island as well. The former is too dangerous. They have Grade 0 sealed artifacts and powerhouses at the level of angels. The latter can be considered. Transform into a nighthawk or a bishop and sneak in to listen to the singing and consume the potion. That's not right. The church rears mermaids to target faceless beyonders, so how can they not be on guard against this point? I have to think of another way. Klein was about to ask the second question when he saw a new sheet of white paper come out of the radio transceiver. Great Master, I must abide by certain rules. You must answer a question of mine in exchange. Answer your question. Klein raised his eyebrows slightly and waited for Rhodes to ask the question. He decided to acknowledge this servant depending on the situation. Amidst the clacking, Rhodes used words to spell out a question. What are you planning to have for breakfast today? Nice question. Klein calmly replied, depends on what the inn offers. A perfect answer. Rhodes was almost short of giving a round of applause. Without waiting for Klein to speak, it continued to type, the aura above the spirit world is about to disappear. I await the next opportunity to be at your service, Great Master. After the illusory piece of paper was spat out, the radio transceiver stopped and lost its gloomy feel. How many days would it take above the gray fog before I can contact Rhodes again? I'll ask it for the method to remove the mental corruption of a beyonder characteristic the next time. Yes, this method should be used prudently. Rhodes can use the special connection after the radio transceiver is tainted by the aura. Those who are stronger and more terrifying than it might be capable of doing so as well. If I keep doing this, maybe one day I'll get a telegram from the true creator or the primordial demoness. Klein's mind raced as he noticed the hidden risks. East Chester County, the Hall family manor. Audrey sat at the dressing table and lit a candle. Afterwards, she looked at herself in the mirror across from the slightly swaying light of the fire. Her green eyes gradually became deep, making it impossible for anyone who laid eyes on them to shift their eyes away, as if even their souls wished to drown in them. Audrey, you have to remain lucid tonight in the dream, she said to herself softly. This was a simple, psychological cue. The ancient folk song she had heard at dusk had inspired her to explore her dreams and see if she could enter the sea of subconscious sea and the spiritual skies of all living things. This was an experiment that other psychiatrists had never attempted. At least, there was no similar experiences in the reference materials provided by the psychology alchemists, giving oneself a psychological cue to explore their own dreams. Perhaps I might be able to find traces of a mind dragon or even the City of Miracles, Liveseed. Audrey withdrew her gaze, removed Lie, which was now in the form of a ruby necklace, and placed it inside a jewelry box. She was afraid that the mystical item that amplified her emotions would affect her while in her dream and cause unnecessary harm, therefore, she removed it in advance out of caution. After doing all of this, Audrey subconsciously looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw little blemishes on her face. While wearing Lie, she felt that her beauty was intoxicating. Wake up, Audrey. That's only a lie. She lifted her right palm and caressed her cheek. At that moment, she was very glad that she had chosen the name Lie for that mystical item. It kept her constantly alert. Otherwise, she feared the day that she would one day be completely dependent on it and not want to face her true self. The day she lost it, it would be very possible that she would lose control. Those girls who are relatively ordinary looking might never wish to take it off again after wearing Lie to perfect their looks. They might be willing to die to keep it on them. For a beyonder, I can't have such a state of mind either. Audrey sighed and stood up. She walked briskly and expectantly through the warm room in her slippery silk robe, back to the soft, comfortable, and springy bed, and pulled a rope from the headboard. Her personal maidservant, Annie, entered and gently extinguished the lights. Before long, Audrey fell asleep. In the hazy world, she suddenly jolted to her senses and realized that she was dreaming. She looked around with interest and silently said to herself, "Is this what's known as lucid dreams in psychology?" In mysticism, there is a similar concept. It's really effective. I relied on a simple psychological cue that I planted in myself to get a lucid dream. Audrey, you really are a genius. No, 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 this is mainly an application of a beyonder power. I mustn't be arrogant. At this moment, Audrey had already figured out what the current dream was. She was walking along a dark, narrow road surrounded by a dark forest, and ahead of her was the castle with its spires. The prolonged howls of the wolves, the slow and frightening gasps, and the shrill and intermittent screams came from every direction, creating a dangerous and depressing atmosphere. I haven't gotten over the fear of Duke Negan's assassination. I'm still afraid that one day, many Beyonders would suddenly attack my father, my mother, and my brothers. Audrey dissected her dreams from the point of view of a psychiatrist. In this strangely real dream, she walked slowly toward the castle that was almost identical to the Hall family's ancestral house. As she walked, a figure suddenly jumped out of the dark forest. It was a gigantic dragon with golden scales all over its body. Its eyes were pale gold with vertical pupils, and its thick tail looked like it could sweep away everything. This dragon's facial features were exactly the same as Audrey's. When paired with its body, it gave off an indescribable feeling of strangeness and horror. Audrey jumped in fright, almost waking up from her dream. Fortunately, having been a spectator before, she was able to stabilize her emotions in time. This made her realize that she had never really forgotten how she had almost lost control back when she consumed the psychiatrist potion. Back then, her self-relief and the improvement in her mood was only superficial. The trauma had already taken root in the depths of her subconscious and would occasionally reflect itself in her dreams. Fortunately, I discovered this today. In the future, I can try to treat this trauma in my subconscious. I'm a psychiatrist. If I continue to ignore this issue, I might lose control due to this fear when advancing to sequence 6. Audrey examined herself carefully. As she walked and stopped, Audrey's dream kept changing in an erratic fashion. It would have been considered quite an unsatisfactory story. Finally, she arrived in front of the castle and saw an arm-length magic staff sweeping through the air, scattering down specks of light that were as resplendent as starlight. The castle that was shrouded in the light instantly became magnificent, and all the gloom disappeared. The melody of a band came out from inside the castle as one wall lamp after another lit up. This was the most beautiful expectation that I had towards Beyonder powers at the very beginning. It really was a little girl's fantasy. The corners of Audrey's mouth curled up, and her mood turned for the better. She didn't stop, but she walked past the castle to the edge of her dream. She didn't care how the scene behind her changed, or how the story unfolded. After walking for an unknown amount of time, she passed through the barren wasteland and arrived at the top of a cliff. Looking out, the gray, blurry void extended into the distance. The area beneath her was so deep that it seemed to be bottomless. Audrey was keenly aware that this was the boundary of her dreams. Once she left, she had no idea what would happen. And how do I leave? Jump down? Will I fall to my death? Audrey thought awkwardly, not too courageous in taking the risk. After thinking for a few seconds, she slowly came up with an idea. This is a dreamland that originates from the world of my mind. As the mistress of this place, I can use my will to open up a path for myself. With the thought of making the attempt, she tried to conjure what she thought, just like the way she did it above the gray fog. The only difference was that the former needed the help of Mr. Fool, and now she had to rely on herself. Audrey stretched out her right hand, pointing it downwards into the depths of the gray fog. In front of her, the gray fog suddenly surged, revealing layers of stairs that led downwards. Without an end in sight, Audrey took a slow breath, lifted her skirt slightly, and stepped onto the first step. Step by step, she continued down the stairs. The surroundings grew increasingly quiet, so quiet that it was almost as if she heard auditory hallucinations. In this place, there was nothing else apart from the grey fog. It was lonely and filled with the unknown. A howling gale blew in from different directions, causing Audrey to sway back and forth. The fear she felt slowly deepened. Before she lost control of her emotions, her green eyes shone with a warm light that seemed to be able to see through the hearts of others. Audrey used her psychoanalysis powers to placate herself. She continued her search. After nearly a minute, a point of light suddenly lit up in the surrounding grey fog. Audrey took a cautious look, only to see that the point of light was of herself, back when she had just consumed a potion and almost became a dragon monster. While on the verge of losing control, emotions such as worry, horror, fear, and nervousness were clearly overflowing from her. This is my subconscious, so this is my trauma. Audrey vaguely understood where she was after she left her dreamland. She was in no hurry to resolve this trauma as she continued to walk down, step by step, filled with anticipation. According to the theories of the psychology alchemists, the subconscious was at the bottom of her destination, the sea of collective subconscious for all living creatures. During her exploration, Audrey once again saw herself listening to her parents' storytelling when she was young. She saw herself, someone who valued her image but wasn't actually very elegant deep down. She saw herself participating in the tarot club, only that all the specks of light regarding the latter were tightly wrapped in a grey fog. These are things in my subconscious. They influence my character and behavior. Audrey instinctively analyzed what she saw with her knowledge of psychology. Amidst the coruscating points of light, there were several times where she was pushed to the verge of an emotional breakdown due to the lonely, aimless exploration, but she had used her beyond her powers to placate herself in time. Just as she was about to lose all sense of the passage of time, she saw the last step. In front of the steps was a solid, blurry, grey ground. Above it, there were streams of light and shadows. They were dense and overlapping, like an illusory sea. The sea of collective subconscious. Audrey took a few steps forward and raised her head to look up. To her surprise, the grey fog no longer blocked her vision as the clear high skies appeared. There were countless indescribable silhouettes, 7 of which were of different colors. They were lustrous brilliances that seemed to possess immense knowledge. Audrey pursed her lips and happily said to herself, "The sky of spirituality." Then, she cautiously moved forward, forging the adventure that she could call her own. Those figures of light that formed the sea would flash past her from time to time. Some contained ancient memories of being burned by flames, while others bore the excruciating pain of seeing something indescribable. Apart from the imprints of the ancients from ancient times, Audrey also saw the gazes of admiration cast on her one after another, as well as the activities of the people who worshipped dragons. As she walked, she noticed a grayish-white mountain on the far left. It extended upwards until it emerged from the sea of light and shadows. The top of the mountain was shrouded in a dense fog, making the entire place seem hazy. Is that someone else's consciousness? The sea is the subconscious, and beyond the surface of the sea is the ordinary consciousness. Yes, he's dreaming. Audrey suddenly thought of a possible application of a psychiatrist. It was to move closer and climb up, directly affecting the other party's subconscious thoughts, allowing them to naturally act according to her bidding. But it should be very difficult and very dangerous. Audrey looked away, not daring to make the attempt. She clearly remembered that her purpose this time was to seek out traces of the mind dragon in the City of Miracles, Liveseed. Audrey passed by more than 100 other people's consciousness. Gradually, she felt exhausted. It's time to return. Instinctively, she raised her head and looked into the distance, rationally making the decision. She stood there for a long time, unwilling to leave. A shadow suddenly appeared in the air just as Audrey was about to turn around. It was a pair of 2 huge grey wings. Under the wings, there was a long lizard-like monster. Its entire body was covered with huge scales that were like grayish-white stone slabs. It had 4 thick and powerful legs, seemingly bathing in the sunlight that didn't exist as it flickered in what seemed like the afterglow of the setting sun. The monster flew over. Its eyes were pale gold with its pupils vertical, looking cold and arrogant. Its grand and epic figure quickly disappeared into the sea of the subconscious of all living beings. Dragon. A mind dragon. Audrey jumped on the spot and looked around, afraid of others noticing her inelegant behavior. She paced around excitedly, feeling very satisfied with her adventure. Indeed, the tradition of dragon worship here isn't without an origin. In their subconscious, there lives a mind dragon. Audrey resisted the urge to praise herself and had decided to return immediately and wake up from the dream. She didn't have the urge to continue her exploration, as she wasn't prepared for it at all. She was going to consult Mr. Fool, Mr. Hanged Man, and the others at the Tarot Club next week in the hope of receiving some advice. Audrey returned the way she came, entering the mountain formed by her consciousness. Then, she woke herself up and successfully escaped from the dream. At that moment, Danitz was also permitted to return to his room. He glanced at Gehrman Sparrow and said with an embarrassed smile, "You won't tell anyone what you just saw, will you?" Klein didn't answer with yes or no. Instead, he stopped walking towards his bedroom and flatly said, "That was a question." Right, a question. That was a slanderous question with no basis. Besides, I also gave a negative answer. Danitz responded with delight and had emphasized that he had never admitted to it. Klein gently nodded his head. "I will clarify this with your captain." Clarify, Danitz stared, then he half opened his mouth, his expression twisted. He was also considered a somewhat knowledgeable person, so he stopped explaining and arguing, and he forced a smile. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Klein took a deep breath and used his clown powers to control his facial expression. "Monitor it well." "Yes, all right." Danitz quickly agreed. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow turn around and walk to the bedroom's entrance, he couldn't help but ask, "You're not going to clarify this with Captain, right?" Klein twisted the handle and replied expressionlessly, "Monitor it well." After he finished speaking, he pushed open the door and entered the room. Before he could widen his mouth into a laugh, he closed the door behind him. The next morning, after breakfast, Klein put on a pair of pantaloons, a thick brown jacket, and a cap. He changed his appearance and went out, leaving Danitz alone in the room to watch the radio transceiver. Along the way, Klein changed his appearance again, making himself look more like a native. He found a special store, bought a pair of linen gloves, a shroud, and a body bag. Then, according to the surroundings he had previously witnessed, he scanned the area around him for landmarks before finding the bridge and the girl who had died amid the mud in a corner. As it was still winter, the weather wasn't too hot, and there were no obvious signs of decay from the corpse, but the festering skin and the stench still made Klein instinctively nauseous. He didn't immediately come to bury the girl who wanted to live like a human being last night. Due to the recent events, Byam was under strict curfews at night, as well as the fact that the cemetery didn't open until dawn. Pulling out a small metal bottle, Klein poured some quelag oil onto his hand and rubbed it at the tip of his nose. A choking sensation invaded his mind. The smell of peppermint mixed with disinfectant filled his olfactory senses, making him sober as if he had just fallen into a sea of floating ice. He was no longer affected by any other smells. Putting away the metal bottle, Klein put on his gloves, took a few steps forward, and crouched next to the female corpse. He unwrapped the shroud and began to gently move the corpse into the body bag. Carrying the bag over his shoulder, he deliberately walked through the most bustling streets of Byam until he reached the outskirts of Edty. Along the narrow road where horse carriages couldn't pass, he scaled a mountain. To its mountain-happy face there was a cemetery specially prepared by the Church of Storms and the Governor-General's office, for the natives. As for foreigners, such as businessmen, adventurers, people from Lone, Intis, and Fainapotter, who had settled down here, they had their cemeteries situated on the opposite side of Byam on a flat and soothing plain with forests backing them. Klein climbed higher and higher and entered the unnamed cemetery, where he found the gravekeeper dozing off. "How do you want to bury him?" The gravekeeper pointed at the body bag. "If you want to do it for free, you have to wait a few days until the corpses in the morgue accumulate to a certain amount, then they'll be cremated together and buried in the same grave. Of course, there will be priests who will do a send-off for the souls of the dead in advance. 5 soldi and he will have an urn and a niche he can call his own. £2, he'll get an urn and a grave with a tombstone. If you don't want him cremated, you'll need a coffin. You can pick one over there. They're priced differently based on the type of wood." Klein thought for a moment, then he took out 5 soldi in notes and handed them over. "What's his name?" The gravekeeper counted the notes, picked up a fountain pen, and asked with a good attitude. He didn't actually know how to write words, he just wanted to draw symbols to help him remember. Klein paused for a second and said, "Boerdi. Boerdi." The gravekeeper repeated it in a low voice and drew a symbol. Without looking up, he continued, "She can have an epitaph on the niche." Boerdi was a typical female name in the Roorsted archipelago, therefore, the gravekeeper no longer mistook her gender. Klein remained silent for a few seconds, then he said in a low voice, "She is a human being." "She is a human being. What a strange epitaph." The gravekeeper muttered, "Do you have a picture?" "I know you don't." Before he could finish his words, he saw the other party hand over a photo. It was a portrait that Klein had drawn using a ritual. It perfectly reproduced the girl's looks before she fell ill. In order to not be suspected, he used the corresponding type of paper and some technique to make the portrait look like a real photograph. The gravekeeper was surprised but didn't say anything. He quickly took the information and carried the body bag to the hut where the priests resided with Klein. After the send-off and cremation, as well as the storing of ashes into an urn, the photograph was pasted on, and an epitaph was engraved, putting an end to the entire matter. Klein took a deep look before turning around to leave the cemetery. As he walked down the mountain path, he saw Biam in its entirety. The sea was pale blue, nearing the color of green. It was empty as far as the eye could see. Sails were stacked by the harbor, and the chimneys towered high. The streets were crisscrossed as people came and went. The surrounding estates were densely packed, and there was plenty of greenery. The distant public roads were wide, and the railways were straight. It was like a beautiful oil painting that was produced by a master. It was filled with vitality that was hardly describable. At the top of the clock tower of the Cathedral of Waves, the Church of Storms Cardinal, high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers, John Cotman, stood at the edge, looking out over the refreshing sea and the mountain range that stretched out along the coastline. The pollution in Biam was rather low as the mining and smelting industries were located in other cities on the island. The mainstay here was the spice trade, the brothels and casinos, and the accumulation and transit of goods. It lacked a fully formed industry, and there was a limited number of days needed for coal to be burned for heat. As soon as Sea King John Cotman retracted his gaze, he saw a mandated punisher running up the spiral staircase. "Your Eminence, there's new information." The mandated punisher struck the left side of his chest with his right hand. "What is it?" The well-built John Cotman turned around and asked. The mandated punisher handed over the piece of paper in his hand. "News from within the resistance. They've received a response from Helvetia. They're in the process of creating new statues." "New statues?" John Cotman unfolded the note and skimmed through it. He then turned his head to the interior of Blue Mountain Island, which was covered in a sea of dense forests. After a moment of thought, he said, "Search for abnormalities in the archipelago's sea area." He was certain of one thing from the intelligence, that the mysterious person who had taken away the characteristic left by Helvetia hadn't left the waters of the Roorsted archipelago. This could be determined from the fact that the person could disguise himself as Helvetia and reply to his followers. Meanwhile, John Cotman knew very well that the beyonder characteristic left behind by Helvetia, who had gone mad before its death, would lead to severe side effects regardless of whether or not it was reduced to a real item, therefore, it would definitely result in an abnormality in the surrounding area. Moreover, he believed that it wouldn't be easy for the mysterious person to find a proper sealing method. Even if he had found it, there was no way he could control the effects when responding, hence, exposing the problem. This was the clue. Yes, Your Eminence, may the storm be with you. The mandated Punisher bowed again. After entering Byam City, Klein dispelled his faceless power when no one was paying attention. He returned to the Wind of Azure in via carriage. As soon as he opened the door and entered, he saw Danitz sitting in front of the radio transceiver, his expression strange and grave. Got something? Klein asked in a low voice. No, no. Danitz raised his right palm and shook the papers in his hand. My bounty. My bounty has been raised to five pounds. This was almost reaching Steel Mavadi's bounty. Because of this, he didn't dare head out to drink or relax, all he could do was stay in the room and listen out for a signal. This rate of appreciation is really tempting. For a moment Klein didn't know how to react, so he said without expression, this is just the beginning. Mr. 10,000 pounds. Dogsh asterisk T. Danitz cursed inwardly, but he didn't dare to show any disrespect on his face. All of those things were done by Gehrman Sparrow. Why did it end up increasing my bounty? Those sons of batches from the Church of Storms. He forced a smile and shook his head, his facial muscles twitching slightly. Klein held back his laughter and ignored him. He went back to his bedroom to catch up on his sleep. At this moment, he saw a letter suddenly appear, floating down from midair and landing right in front of him. Klein raised his right hand and grabbed the letter. The messenger didn't even show its face and just left after throwing the letter. Klein clicked his tongue, opened the letter, and read it. There were two methods for obtaining a messenger. The first method is to think of an accurate description, hold a ritual, summon the corresponding spirit world creature, and make a contract with it. The second method is to directly enter the spirit world and search for a messenger that you wish to obtain. After obtaining its consent, sign a contract with it and then record down the accurate description language for later use. The first method is relatively simple, but it is also rather dangerous, because what fits the description might be a powerful spirit world creature or a strange evil spirit. Every time you summon it, you cannot be completely sure what you will attract, and this is a risk that is hard to divine in advance. The danger of the second method is that it isn't easy to find the appropriate messenger, and there's a risk of getting lost in the spirit world. Unless you're a traveler, otherwise, I do not suggest the second method. For the first method, I can provide you a description that has been tested and verified. As long as the process is done accurately, the level of danger will be rather low. But it might not satisfy you. Also, the contract needs to use powers in the undead domain. You can use my copper whistle to provide for that. The format includes the following paragraphs. Of course, if you don't mind, I can transfer a messenger to you as a gift and have it sign a contract with you. Transfer it to me as a gift. It's no wonder that the messenger didn't even dare show its face. Klein thought in enlightenment. Considering that he had used the previous messenger as a shield and was unfortunately finished off by Mr. A, causing the later messengers to become increasingly rude to him, he inwardly declined the offer. Use the first or second method. The first method is prone to error. I might even summon a candidate messenger and get beaten up. A commonly used description isn't unique enough, making the messenger's strength worrying. The second method? I'm not afraid of getting lost since I'm able to instantly return above the gray fog. Furthermore, in my spirit body state, I can use the Sea God Scepter. The spirit world creatures aren't afraid of having their blood drained either. Yes, I have to do it outside the archipelago, otherwise, I'll be affected by the prayers. Klein quickly came to a decision. With that idea in mind, Klein immediately began making preparations. It was to explore the spirit world and select a suitable target to become a messenger. After he left the Rörsted archipelago and its surrounding sea, he could bring the sea god scepter along with him to reason with the target and convince them to become his messenger. Once I find myself lost or in a dangerous situation, would immediately halt the summoning and return above the grey fog. There's basically no risk. Klein thought for a few seconds, then he locked the door and began the ritual of summoning himself. At the end of the ritual, he quickly arrived above the grey fog, but he was in no hurry to respond to himself. Instead, he sat down and let the sea god scepter fly out from the junk pile and land on his palm. He intended to scan the prayers of the believers as per routine for anything to respond to. During this process, Klein discovered that some of the prayers were actually quite interesting, because humans could deceive friends and relatives, but it was difficult to keep their truest thoughts when confessing or praying to the gods. At most, they would modify the truth to make them look less bad. A mixed blood, who had clearly changed his faith to the Lord of Storms, had already reached the middle ranks of the Byam police department, but in his confession, he tried hard to portray his behavior as a plan of burdening himself to carry out a mission. For the sake of a brighter future for his kinsmen, he could only confess to God in misery, hoping that He would protect him, so that he could climb up the ranks in the police system as a believer of the Lord of Storms. Although his words sounded flawless, the fluctuations in his thoughts and emotions during his confession were clearly displayed in the prayer scene. It was something that couldn't be hidden. Trying to deceive God while you are deceiving yourself. If it were a gigantic sea serpent like Helvetia who lacked intelligence, it might have believed you. Should I give him a lightning bolt or 10 wind blades? Yes, it's pretty impressive to have a mixed blood rise up to the ranks of senior inspector. I'll keep him. There are benefits to having a snitch. Klein raised his sea god staff, making one of the blue gems glow. The light poured into the scene and imperceptibly seeped into the senior inspector named Belaya. This wasn't a curse, nor was it a cue. It was a mark of divinity that almost no one could discover. Simply put, it's a unilateral way for me to keep tabs on you. Klein silently added inwardly. He continued browsing and saw a young believer with slightly curly bronze hair praying for a man named Zhangma to be caught in a storm and buried at sea. He claimed that Zhangma wasn't pious enough, but the truth was that, as a competing fisherman, Zhangma was always able to harvest more fish than he did. What kind of nonsense prayers are these? The human heart sure is hard to fathom. Klein frowned and mumbled to himself. Then he had a vague idea. For a faceless to engage in real acting, it not only requires a flawless performance in terms of external appearances and habitual actions, but it also needs to maintain the core personality. Not many changes are allowed. As for personality, every person is different, so there must be a difference to a certain degree. By browsing the prayers of my believers, it's equivalent to me realizing different kinds of personalities and mental states without going through the trouble. When talking about the many masks we wear, it's not only about looks. This will be rather important for my subsequent acting as a faceless. It can save me time from figuring things out through accumulated experiences. Klein increasingly felt that acting as sea god was very beneficial towards him. When you are acting the role of a demigod, even if you don't get any feedback, you will still definitely get some considerable benefits. This is a way of gaining experience of being someone of a higher level. Klein perked up, no longer being perfunctory about skimming through the prayer scenes. After quickly browsing through one scene after another, his gaze stopped at a merchant named Ralph. The businessman praised the miracle of the reappearance of the sea god, and he had indicated that he planned to offer a third of his fortune, worth £20,000, to the resistance, half for military expenses, and half for the reconstruction of God's statue. Actually, there's no need to go through all that trouble. Just directly offer it to me. Klein muttered half-jokingly. He thought for a moment, and then he conjured a background of waves and storms with heavy rain and lightning falling together. He responded in a low voice, "You have honored my name by helping your compatriots and companions. The young lambs need help, food, and education." He intended to get Ralph to set up a charity fund with the £20,000, and to seek donations widely from the community to make up for the damage, create a consensus, and help to provide local children with food, clothing, and education under the pretext of governance. As for the military expenditures of the resistance, Klein understood that in a world with beyonder powers, it was very difficult to rely solely on the opposition from the natives of the colony to succeed. Therefore, they needed the help of foreign countries like Fasak and Intis. Funding was undoubtedly needed. Unfortunately, it's not possible to add a line in the Ten Commandments about boldly and confidently seek funding that would damage the image of sea God. The resistance shouldn't be thinking about annihilating the garrison troops. They should just focus on destroying the transportation infrastructure and make it more difficult for the Governor-General's office to rule, so as to initiate talks. As a keyboard warrior, Klein wasn't lacking in ideas in such areas. He quickly restrained his wandering thoughts and made a divination to see if it was dangerous exploring the spirit world today. After obtaining the revelation that it wasn't considered dangerous, Klein took the Dark Emperor card, naturally changed his image, and stepped into the door of summoning. After entering the real world, he stuffed the mystical items he needed into his body as a precaution. Then, like last time, he used cogitation to sense the spirit world. Taking a step forward, he passed through an invisible curtain as Klein's illusory figure floated up. Around him, red, yellow, blue, green, and other colors were superimposed, like they were like the most abstract oil painting ever. The concept of direction that humans were used to could no longer be used here. If one used the old means of distinguishing direction and one's location, they would definitely find themselves lost. Klein roamed carefully and casually, sometimes seeing a yellow sun like a child's sketch, sometimes brushing past an incorporeal river that flowed quietly. There was also a flat woman with her upper body naked and a face resembling a smiling moon, a canoe with its end upturned, a tangled ball of thread, and a serpentine staircase leading to the 7 pure lights. In this extremely chaotic world, other than spirit world creatures, all kinds of information existed as abstract symbols. Thus, what one received from a divination process would only be a revelation that required one to interpret it on their own. As for those symbols, there was a chance that they would come to life and become incorporeal monsters. This was the spirit world that couldn't be understood and viewed with common human knowledge. The last time he came in, he had easily discovered spirit world creatures, and he had noticed the creepy gazes from unknown locations that made his hair stand on end. There was the headless woman who carried 4 heads, a round eye with clear blacks and whites, and a giant jellyfish with a skull attached to each tentacle. He had easily encountered all of them back then. But this time, he failed to see a single spirit world creature despite roaming for so long. Even the indescribable figures in the distance had disappeared, as if they had hidden themselves. It can't be that you're afraid of being my messenger, can it? Yes, I entered the spirit world in the form of a soul body. Perhaps the thoughts in my mind will appear in a special, formless manner here, turning into hidden symbols that interact with the spirit world. This then naturally affects my path options. Klein was puzzled, but he couldn't find the reason. For, all sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind when his body suddenly sank down and he fell freely. After a while, Klein could only see the vivid superposition of the colors and the various symbols that took physical form. What's going on? He began to consider whether he should write to Mr. Azek and ask him about it, or to throw the radio transceiver above the gray fog and get it tainted with the aura, so that he could contact the magic mirror, Rhodes. While floating, Klein's heart suddenly palpitated as he quickly dodged to the side. A tinge of yellow and green flashed across his eyes as a giant foot that was large enough to squash his entire body landed, stepping into the interlaced red and blue color spots. Above the sole of the foot was a long, festering leg covered in a yellowish-green liquid. The leg was over 3 meters long, and above it was a huge body that was wrapped in corpse oil bandages. Amidst the solidified aura in the area, the 2 legs that were filled with yellow-green pus alternated as they rose up. Carrying a body that was difficult to discern, the legs quickly disappeared into the depths of the spirit world. Klein stood at a distance, not daring to make a sound. Finally, he confirmed that he was fine as he grimaced and thought, the spirit world is really scary. You can accidentally encounter a powerhouse just passing by. A powerhouse among the spirit world creatures? Klein shook his head and continued his search. At that moment, he had no idea where in the spirit world he had wandered to. After drifting for a while, he finally found some traces of spirit world creatures. Just as he was about to switch from flying forward to descending to his left, he was surprised to find that his body continued to move forward uncontrollably at an accelerating speed. In front of him, the chaotic superimposed colors and the grayish-white mist that filled the area suddenly split open, and a large, purely black three-masted sailboat leaped in. The boat was nearly 100 meters long, and 3 pitch-black sails were hanging high up like flags. On the left and right sides of the ship, there were cannon muzzles and all kinds of sailors were running around on the deck. All of this was so real, so substantial, and so out of place when it came to the spirit world as a whole. However, as the ship entered the spirit world, its black color quickly turned richer, tainting itself with an ethereal vibe. On its deck stood a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high, its back facing the cabin. Leaning against the chair's back, a colossal figure that was comparable to an ancient giant sat there. He had a black beard that went just past his neck, and he wore a tall, pointed crown on his head. He wore a gorgeous black robe with silver fringes. The wrinkles on his face looked hardened and filled with magnificence. It made one subconsciously wish to bow their heads. Under the slightly wrinkled forehead and on the high nose bridge, Klein's pitch-black full-body armor and black crown were reflected into those 2 dark red eyes. As for Klein, he was having trouble stopping his slow flight toward the giant. Their gazes met among the layers of colors and symbols in the spirit world, and then Klein disappeared. The giant on the mottled stone chair didn't withdraw his gaze as he continued staring over in a long silence. Chapter 560, The Hanged Man Gets Fleeced. Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Above the fog, Klein took out the Dark Emperor card that he had fused with his spirit body and instantly reverted to his original form. This is called a one-click gear swap, he mocked himself as he recalled what had just happened. He was almost certain that the giant, wearing the sharp crown, was king of the 5 seas, Nast Solomon. The 100-meter-long sailboat that could sail through the spirit world was the ghost ship named Dark Emperor, which was built by the ancient Solomon Empire. I've always thought that a ghost ship simply means that it can sail on its own and wouldn't sink, making it closer to a strange creature. I never thought that the most powerful ghost ship would be able to turn itself incorporeal and wander through the spirit world. That makes it almost a demigod, right? As expected of the most famous Dark Emperor on the 5 seas. Yes. I can't eliminate the possibility that it sacrificed a traveler during its creation process. For one of the most famous legendary treasures, the Spectre Empire, which carries the final inheritance of the Trunsoist Empire, could it be that the ship also comes equipped with this capability, making it impossible to find? Klein's thoughts slowly drifted without immediately realizing the reason why he had suddenly met King of the 5 Seas, Nast. This was very obvious, the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics. Although the Dark Emperor card didn't contain any Beyonder characteristics, Roselle had added or carved something onto the card when he made it. It allowed the wielder to use the card of blasphemy after they advanced to a high-sequence Beyonder, to subtly sense the Beyonder ingredients that they needed. There was no doubt that such a sensation was mutual. As one sensed the other would naturally sense them too. As for the wielder, they would appear to approach a certain fate before they crossed that step into becoming a demigod. This was something Klein was deeply aware of. He ultimately suspected that the existence of the grey fog had brought together certain Beyonders or supernatural events to him. Traveling with the Dark Emperor card in the spirit world makes it easier for such situations to occur. This is because the real world needs to abide by many rules. Even the fate from drawing lots needs to abide by logic, developing bit by bit. It doesn't make sense for me to use the Dark Emperor card in Backlund, and for the king of the 5 seas, Nast, to immediately appear in front of me with the ghost ship. Even if he sensed the attraction force, he would have to go through the process of locating me, and through the process of traveling through the spirit world, take hours or even days to arrive. If he didn't sense it, he would only naturally think of sailing towards the Sonia Sea and head closer to the borders of the Lone Kingdom. In that case, it might take months before we bump into each other. By being in the spirit world, things are simple, there is no concept of distance or direction in there. Locations and distances are all extremely chaotic. Perhaps the king of the 5 seas, Nast, might have wished to go out on a spin in the spirit world, but he ended up seeing me pass by the moment he entered. This doesn't need to abide by any restrictions or limitations on geographical locations, Klein thought as he wrapped the corner of the model table. In addition to this, he was certain that the reason why he was thrown uncontrollably towards the Dark Emperor and at King of the 5 seas, Nast, wasn't because of the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics. The effects of the law was only reflected in fate, perception, and desire, nothing too exaggerated, otherwise, there wouldn't be high-sequence beyonders, all of them would be involuntarily drawn by the uniqueness of their respective pathway. Klein could sense that it was a type of beyonder power that twisted and strengthened his intent to move forward, resulting in him being unable to stop. This is a very simple analysis. Even if I had thrown out the Dark Emperor card at the time, I wouldn't have been able to stop. This is a lawyer, which is a beyonder power wielded by the Dark Emperor pathway. Klein leaned back in his chair and decided not to use the Dark Emperor card any time soon. This meant that he was unable to roam the spirit world in search of a messenger. If he hadn't brought the Dark Emperor card and had used his main body with the Sea God Scepter, he would appear in the spirit world, which was filled with all kinds of revelations and information. He would inevitably leave many clues and could be divined about at any time. In terms of anti-divination and anti-prophecy, Azek's copper whistle couldn't be compared to the Dark Emperor card. If I were to really do that, I might meet 10 people who know that I obtained the Sea God Scepter, when buying a beer at the bar. Of course, it was taken by Klein Moretti, so what has that got to do with me, Gehrman Sparrow? Klein shook his head in a self-deprecating manner and decided to use the ritual method to get a messenger to respond. He could find something more suitable later on. After he covered the Dark Emperor card, his figure disappeared from the mysterious space above the gray fog. Early morning, Byam. Alger prepared to take a carriage out of the city and take a detour to a private harbor behind the cliff. That was where his Blue Avenger was docked and waiting to set sail. As a disguised pirate captain, he couldn't dock so openly at the main port of the City of Generosity. That would be sufficient proof that he had close ties with the authorities. It was the same with the other pirates who had to consider their berth in advance before coming to Byam to sell their loot or gain enjoyment. They either went to a small port in the surrounding waters, or to a private port controlled by someone with a deep background or by the resistance. Finally, there are no more missions. I can go out to sea again. I need to first obtain a mystical item that can increase my strength and also square my accounts. After that, I'll head to the primitive island and hunt for the Blue Shadow Falcon, allowing me to advance to Sequence 6 as quickly as possible. Alger was about to walk towards a rental carriage when he unexpectedly saw a familiar figure. The former pirate merchant, Ralph, walked out of the carriage with a ruddy face and looked towards the Governor-General's office that wasn't far away. He seemed to be abnormally excited. What happened to him? After a moment of puzzlement, Alger took the initiative to go over and greet him. From his point of view, Ralph was, in a sense, also one of his comrades. They were all subordinates of Mr. Fool. However, one is a core member, while the other just remains on the periphery. Alger calmly confirmed their identities and positions. What happened to deserve such joy? Alger asked after chatting about the weather. Ralph laughed out loud and narrowed his eyes, saying, "If I were to say that I received the blessings of God, would you believe me?" "I believe." Alger answered in his mind without hesitation. Suppressing his curiosity, he asked, "What are you doing here?" Ralph was about to answer when his eyes suddenly lit up. He looked around, and after confirming that there was no one around him, he said in a deep voice, "Didn't you say that you also believe in God?" In order to befriend him, Alger had lied, saying that his faith lay with sea god, Calvetua. In any case, this was common among pirates, so it wouldn't arouse suspicion. At sea, the weather was usually more frightening than any enemy, so most pirates, adventurers, ship crew, and sailors had great respect for gods who controlled similar fields, believing in them to a certain extent. Of course. This time, Alger's answer was firmer than ever. This was because he knew that the sea god that the other party believed in was the embodiment of Mr. Fool. Ralph nodded in satisfaction, revealed a smile, and whispered, "I received a revelation yesterday. God sent me to help his young lambs. I intend to establish a charitable fund for this purpose. This is the will of God. As his believer, I think you would be happy to provide some assistance." He held out his right hand and waited for the donation. Alger's expression stiffened, and he was momentarily unsure of how to respond. Although his present fortune was worth £3,245, he was preparing to buy a mystical item, making his overall financial situation somewhat tight. Of course, he could still donate quite a bit if he skimped and saved. If the sea god was still Calvetua, Alger, who claimed to be a believer, wouldn't have hesitated to find an excuse. But now, he had to seriously consider the deeper motives of Mr. Fool. Noticing Alger's reaction, Ralph's eyes darted schemingly before he said, "We want to help children who are suffering from unnecessary discrimination because of their bloodline. They live a hard life, and it is hard to see any hope for them. There are pure-blooded natives, as well as mixed bloods." Alger was silent for a few seconds, then he pulled out a wad of cash. "Here's £100. Ralph took it and said with a smile, "Your kindness will definitely be rewarded. God will protect you." The door slanted over the entrance to the warehouse. Klein prepared the summoning ritual for the spirit world creature and was surrounded by the hallucinatory scent of herbs and essential oils. He was afraid that there would be some kind of accident if he held it in the inn, and although it might not be risky for him, it might end up harming the other occupants. Therefore, he went back to the abandoned warehouse where he had gave a sacrifice to Calvetua. As for Danitz, having his bounty raised to £5,500, he was very proactive in asking to stay in the suite and monitor the radio transceiver. "The procedure is to light the candle that symbolizes me, and to use a verified incantation to summon the appropriate spirit world creature as a messenger." Daily Simone's three-line description and the various incantations provided by Mr. Azek went through Klein's mind. When summoning a spirit world creature, the first sentence needed descriptions such as, "wanders about the unfounded," and "roaming in the upper realm." Only by doing so could it accurately point to the spirit world. The suffix would clearly indicate that the spirit body was being summoned and that it was a creature that had a corporeal body. The second and third lines were an accurate description of the creature, but due to the restrictions of the format, one couldn't use too many words to pinpoint a creature. Therefore, it was difficult to predict or divine what would ultimately be summoned by the ritualist. In this sort of situation, using an incantation previously used by others implied a much lower risk. Then, after signing a contract, the description of the third sentence, "the messenger that belongs to whomever," or "contract companion of whoever," could be made, allowing the three-line description to accurately summon the corresponding messenger. "Yes, my messenger has to run very fast, otherwise, it might be killed by some malicious creature in the spirit world, resulting in the loss of important letters." Klein's mind raced, and he came up with a clear plan. He took a step back and said in ancient Hermes, I summon in my name, the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the creature whose speed surpasses imagination." Whoosh! There was the sound of wind, tainting the candles to a dark green and turning the surroundings cold and creepy. Klein saw a blurry figure rush out, too fast for him to see anything. After that, he couldn't find the fellow ever again.